I made a sewing pattern that you can print at home for free and make yourself. I really wanted to do a Valentine's Day project, and I love collars and I also love hearts, so I decided to design an adorable collar that has little hearts as the points, and I didn't really know what I was doing, but I made it, and it's a sewing pattern, so I'm going to show you how to make the sweetheart collar. I've rated this pattern as beginner intermediate because I think top stitching the heart in place is a little bit tricky, but it's pretty easy, especially if you don't do ruffles or anything extra like that. So let's hop to it. To make the sweetheart collar, you're going to begin by printing out the pattern pieces. Make sure to print these actual size or with scaling set to 100%. You can always check on the test square if you're not sure if it's being printed correctly. Then you're going to cut around the cut lines. Those are the solid black lines around the pieces. I've also included a stitch line, more for your information or for adjustments you might want to make. Next, you're going to tape your pieces together, making sure to match up all the numbers. 1 should match up with 1, 2 with 2, 3 with 3, 4 with 4. Using the tie piece is optional. You can also simply cut these rectangles to size. And remember that the size of the tie or the tie piece will also be used to create ruffles if you choose to add ruffles. I like to save all the little extra bits and information in my sketchbook and to also create a quick sketch to figure out what colors I'm going to use for my project. Pin or hold the pattern pieces in place on your fabric. Make sure to cut the collar piece on the fold. You'll need 2 of those, 4 of the hearts, and at least 2 ties. You'll also need 6 extra of the tie pieces if you're going to add ruffles. Have fun with the fabrics here. I like to use a contrasting fabric for the heart versus the body of the collar. You could use different fabrics for everything. This is a great project for scraps because all in all you end up using less than 1 yard or meter of fabric. Don't forget to snip all of your notches into your pattern piece, including the center notches. And if you'd like, you can also mark your pivot points using a fabric marking tool. I like to do this so that I can get really, really sharp corners. I prefer not to use the tie piece, but rather to just cut these to size. Let's start by making the tie. To do this, I like to pin a safety pin to the middle of the top part of one of the ties outside the seam allowance. So obviously you don't want to sew over this safety pin, that would be really, really bad, but this is going to help you turn the tie inside out later. So pin it and then fold your tie in half, right sides together, and we're going to sew around the side, beginning from the short side, pivoting at the corner, and then sewing all the way down the long side. Next, you're going to trim the seam allowance, especially at the corner, and grade if needed. I like to use a really lightweight fabric for this, so that's not necessary, but feel free to experiment. Turn the tie right side out, gently poking out the corners with a long blunt tool and press. This step is optional, but I really like to edge stitch around the 3 sides of the tie that will be exposed in the project later to improve the strength and appearance. Now you're going to pin the tie between the 2 notches on the straightest side of the collar liner piece. This is going to become kind of the inside of one of the 2 points. The liner is the underside of the collar, so pin it to that. Stitch the tie in place with a seam allowance just below 3/8 inch or 1 millimeter. This will ensure that the stitching isn't visible later, and it adds a bit of extra strength to the tie. Now that the tie portion is complete, we're going to do the optional ruffles. Sew together the short sides of the ruffle strips right side together to create a long strip. So you'll be sewing all 6 into a long strip. Fold the short ends in half lengthwise, right sides together, pin and sew the ends of the strip. Then you're going to press all your seams open from the first step, poke out the corners of the step after that, and press. Fold the whole thing in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, and press all the way down. Next, you're going to gather the ruffle. Use a 5mm stitch length and sew 2 parallel lines of gathering stitches pretty close to the open edge, inside the seam allowance if possible. Leave the tails long and do not backstitch these closed. Then you're going to use the 2 threads from one side of one end and pull the fabric gently to gather the threads down. You'll be gathering the ruffles to a length of 48 inches or 122 centimeters. Pin the ruffles to the same collar layer where you sewed the ties. This is the lining once again. Begin pinning just below the bottom of one of the ties. Each seam along the ruffle strip will line up with a notch along the outer edge of the collar. That's why we sewed these together into a long strip using seams instead of just a long piece. Adjust your ruffles as you go to ensure that they're neat and even, and use lots of pins. Pins help. Sew the ruffles in place with a seam allowance just below, once again, just below 3/8 inch or 1 millimeter. This will ensure that the stitching isn't visible later and adds extra strength to the ruffles. Time to make that collar sandwich. Pin your remaining collar piece to your work right sides together. You will be leaving a 4-inch or 10 centimeter gap to turn the project inside out at the back of the neckline. So the part of the collar that's going to hit your neck, leave that open. You may also choose to mark this with a fabric marking instrument so that you don't forget to leave it open. I like to put these little X's because, you know, sometimes you just forget these things. Beginning from one side of the opening, sew all around the collar with a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. The pivot points that you marked before will help you know where to turn the collar. At each pivot point, make sure the needle is down, raise the presser foot, turn your work, lower the presser foot, and continue sewing. Trim the seam allowance down and notch small triangles along the curves. Turn the collar right side out and use, once again, that blunt tool to pop out the corners. Press your work, making sure to fold in the seam allowance at the neckline where you left the gap. Edge stitch the gap closed, or you may hand sew this for a super invisible finish. Now we're going to create and add the hearts. Pin the heart pieces right sides together and sew around the heart, leaving a 2-inch gap on one of the straight sides. Use your marked pivot points to ensure that you're stitching really accurately. The seam allowance and notch small triangles once again along the curves. Turn the heart right side out and use a blunt tool to pop out the corners. Press, making sure to fold in the seam allowance where you left the gap. Line the points of the heart up with the points of the collar. Pin in place. You may choose to edge stitch this down with a machine or sew it by hand for a really invisible finish. If sewing with a machine, make sure to use a matching thread to the heart unless you are very skilled at top stitching around tight curves. Stitch the heart in place, beginning from a straight edge of the heart. Go slowly and try to sew around the heart curves without having to pivot the fabric. So I really try to ease around those curves so that I don't end up with these weird straight lines around them. This step, like I said, is a bit tricky, but it's totally worth the adorable finish. Finally, it's time to praise your assistant for her good work. And enjoy your finished collar. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoy this project. If you do, please feel free to hashtag it Sweetheart Collar and tag me at Neon Fuzz Studio on Instagram. If you have any questions about this pattern, I am super happy to answer them. And I really, really hope you like it as much as I do. Bye, friends.